Right, we're going to start the very first Boston Apothecary pivot to video. People keep asking me to do videos. They keep asking to show them more of what some of the processes I use look like, especially with the Birectifier. Probably in a non-linear way, we'll show all of the processes, but today we're just going to start here. We have 8 Birectifier fractions in front of us. They are from analyzing the river spirit from Granada. This was sort of a gift from a blog patron, and the idea was to see what makes it tick, sort of explain why this person likes it so much. So where is its magic? The fractions, I've already tasted these one time, so we have 20 milliliters left. They did start as 25 milliliter fractions. And what we're going to do is line them up, properly dilute them, and then go through them in series. So just to prepare the samples, we're going to do it really pragmatic way, just to do it quick. What's so beautiful about the Birectifier system is that you can do it neurotic. You could use nothing but disposables, that pipette tips that never get reused, and or you can sort of cut a little corners to get it done for the context that you're doing. So what we're going to do is simply pour out a measure. Since our 5 milliliter pipetter can't stick down the neck, we are going to properly adjust it back to 5. We're going to suck up see, it's very easy to make mistakes, very easy to recover. We're going to suck up a proper 5 milliliters. I'm going to put it in here. So the first 4 fractions, we're going to have 2x dilution. In the last 4 fractions, we're going to have 1x dilution. This is not the system that Raphael Arroyo used, but it is the system that Carl Miko used. Or not Carl Miko used it, and Dr. Luckow. And then so that last milliliter, we just put it right back in our volumetric flask. We have water prepared. And then we put a watch glass cover on it because we're going to let them sit for possibly an hour before we actually do the tasting. So these videos are going to be designed that you should speed them up. You should never pay attention to me at 1x. Go 1.25x in YouTube, or even 1.5, and possibly I'll use some editing tricks to make it even go faster than that. So you're going to see me do it all, but also we're going to talk about what's in some of the fractions. So in the first fraction here, we're going to find the vast majority of all the ethyl acetate in the spirit, as well as just a couple special things. You can find ethyl formate if it exists. You can find probably isoamyl acetate. I've only experienced it in a couple bourbons. It can get there in column stills in a couple ways, and it can probably get there through extreme maturation of the very heaviest rums. And that was just seen in the Money Musk MMW mark. It's also been seen in some Hampden rums. And that's the first fraction. The second fraction ends up being like a diminutive version of the first fraction. And it can just sort of give you an indication of the strength of the two, just the degree of spillover, and it can give you sort of a different context to evaluate some of the aromas that are kind of at the headier end of the spirit. sometimes in the first fraction things can be overly concentrated. They can be sort of what I call non-culinary. They cross a line in the thresholds of perception and getting above what they call like a recognition threshold, and just their nature changes. And any fruitiness that might become a common descriptor can go into like gluiness and things that are just non-culinary. And they can just be sort of like a marker of concentration. So some people can even find acetone as a descriptor, but then acetone is not going to be present as a chemical compound. It's just going to be ethyl acetate concentrated to a certain amount. It's going to resemble how we experience acetone. But in the second fraction, because it's going to be in a more dilute form, your perception of it can just be a little different. It can give you a different glimpse. The third fraction is characteristically neutral in all but the rarest spirit types. It can just sort of appear very, vodka-esque, in that this fraction is collected very near the azeotrope, and then we're diluting it here, 2x, so we're going to end up with a product that is basically, you're evaluating it at, say, 30% ABV. Probably a hair above that. In all but the rarest spirit types, is it going to be very, very neutral. And then, you'll notice that the pipette is sort of going in and out of things. There's the tiniest dribbles into the water. And just due to the nature of the concentrations, you can evaluate a spirit fairly well without being too neurotic with it. So just, you don't need a new pipette tip every time you do it. It totally can be done if you want to be very clinical, but we're not being clinical today. So if you look at the data that Rafael Arroyo gives us in studies on rum, you'll see that 75%, we're doing the wrong thing, 75% of the fusel oil of a spirit is collected in the fourth fraction. So we can kind of commonly regard the fourth fraction as the fusel oil fraction. And this fraction can tell us a lot about the spirit. We can sort of get a sense of possibly even what the yeast is. Was it a budding yeast? Was it a fission yeast? Fission yeast produce far less fusel oil than a budding yeast, and you can feel it quite clearly. And then sometimes you'll see a descriptor that I use in some of the case studies where there's like a wraith, and it's sort of like when you're evaluating this spirit, you sort of like breathe in, and then it sort of reaches in a little further, like there's like a kind of evil quality to it. And the chemical compound that might be doing it is amyl alcohol, which is sort of like the rougher, the sort of roughest chemical compound that is a higher alcohol that can be in some of these fractions. And fission yeast also produce less amyl alcohols. So you can sort of just get a gentler experience from fusel oil. And it's evident in some rums, especially when you start to compare rums to bourbons. The fusel oil content has been known to be half that of a bourbon. And it really leaps out at you from nothing but organoleptic evaluation. If you wanted to numerically assay higher alcohols in a spirit, you can titrate for it, but it's a very elaborate titration that takes a significant amount of time and preparation. What was surprising is just with the Birectifier method, you can sort of gauge what is, normal, not normal, appropriate, not appropriate, characteristic of your yeast or not, just by plain old organoleptic tasting. And so you just use, you can take it further and use some of Kervagant's ideas of quantitative tasting, where you do systematic dilutions and compare it to a benchmark to know if you have more or less. And then of course we know how to go back to distill differently, to ferment differently, to select a different yeast, to reduce fusel oil. And you can take just simply smelling this and create, an actionable response to the information quite quickly. More quickly than really any other process. And that's just what's sort of special about the Birectifier. When I hit the 4th fraction, I typically start to work backwards. So I'm going to go the 8th back to the 5th. In the very last fractions, some of the characteristics, you could find flaws there. If you had sort of tufo as a flaw, that's where it would appear. If you had other flaws, they might appear there. You can sort of get a sense of furfural organoleptically just by evaluating the last fractions. Sometimes that can be a tell of whether something was pot distilled or not. Then one of the other characteristics that I look for that should not be hard to titrate for either is how much acidity is it? And I call it, very clearly gustatory acidity. You're in your mind comparing it to the acidity of lemonade. And in some spirits that feature a lot of a sort of more like noble volatile acidity, it's going to be easily detectable. And that can tell you that it was pot distilled from a heavy ferment, and that it was also distilled possibly to not the highest ABV. And then some of the Jamaican ferments can sort of challenge that, where, they're from very heavy ferments, that have special properties, particularly lots of volatile acidity, but they are distilled to a high ABV, and yet there is still a concentration that makes these last fractions have substantial volatile acidity. And it's sort of like a nobility. When you really sense just how much acidity is there, you're like, could that be why I like this spirit? If it's too watery, it can almost seem flabby. And a lot of young spirits that maybe didn't gain acidity from the barrel, something that we get from bourbon. Bourbon is very flabby until it's matured. And you need to use the tannins from the barrel to sort of subsidize and offset that flabbiness, where rum often does it with acidity. And then you just see that you might like a tart spirit. And that might be why more pot still spirit is good in blends. Even besides esters and other aromas, it might just bring an acidity that's very pleasing. And it can make spirits more enjoyable when they're also younger. And so it's just something to consider when you're evaluating stuff, is what that acidity is like. Sometimes the 6th, 7th, and 8th fractions can be just very, very similar. And you just sort of remark that one could be identical to the other, or just have another detail, or have another sort of degree of intensity. And in the best case scenario, we would just be performing a titration to look at the acidity. And sometimes that could even tell maybe about the type of acid that it was. If it's sort of, the acidity is strongest at 6 and sort of tapers off, or it goes in the other direction. That is sort of like a theoretic consideration that we just don't know enough about yet. We haven't found enough patterns And then I don't always titrate these. I usually, in the case studies I do, simply go off of organoleptic evaluation. It just seems to be, I get enough information without relying on a number. In the future, though, I'd like to share more numbers as more people are using their birectifiers. We'll see what that looks like. So sometimes in the sixth fraction, you'll have some aroma bleeding over that is characteristic of the fifth. And that is in just truly extraordinary samples. It'll just keep coming. Sometimes you can see droplets that are definitely prevalent in the fifth carry over into the sixth. Sometimes if the spirit is a rum oil bomb, it'll just keeps going. And then other spirits, though, they can be strong in the fifth and then really drop off. So the fifth fraction contains pretty much the majority of the personality of any spirit. Sometimes even up here, there's nothing that can characterize it in a spirit category. You wouldn't know if you have a tequila, a bourbon, or a rum up here, because the congeners are just very simple, easy to name, without a lot of complexity. And then back here, everything ends up being very personality defining. Just the complete personality is nearly defined just by the fifth. It can be, positively extraordinary. There's a lot of visual evaluations that you can make. I wish these glasses were polished better. I'm kind of a little bit crippled, so I couldn't polish them as well as I wanted. And that can make some of the visual evaluations clearer. In the fifth fraction, things can often be loushed. You can have a sort of visible floating emulsion. There can be very significant oil droplets or not. Definitely observing some here. In the subsequent fractions, sometimes there can be almost like precipitated crystal products. It's hard to say what they are. I think that they are, definitely ester or acid related. They could either be very particular types of acid or possibly esters. We haven't done the kind of higher level basic science that would support an easy explanation for what it is. One of the things you'll notice before we taste anything is that the Birectifier works on a 100 milliliter of ethanol system. So, you're putting in an input that looks like 250 milliliters of 40% ABV spirit, but that is 100 milliliters of absolute alcohol. And the Birectifier distills very slowly at a very careful pace, roughly against the azeotrope. So in these first four fractions, you're seeing all the ethanol is right here. I mean, you can even see it. They all have a sort of cloudiness, and even just this dilution, because they're ethanol based, there's a lot of condensation in there. Whereas the ethanol sort of runs out in the fifth fraction for the most part, and then here you're just doing entrained, steam volatile congeners. And that is why they get a different dilution in this particular tasting system. And it can sort of explain what happens is sort of like, you're just like wringing out a towel, and you just see that the moisture just keeps getting like pushed back in it. And a lot of the higher boiling point, less volatile congeners are also just getting all pushed back all the way across from fraction 1 to 8 in the order of their volatility. You know, and the system is very structured in that it prevents any sort of bouncing. So if there was a spike of heat running through your distilling system that challenged the natural reflux, a lot of things here might bounce forward, and you would see some of the stuff that you expect to be in fraction 8, you know, to come over in fraction 5, etc. So everything is structured to really unwind the spirit by volatility and get rid of all the bouncing phenomenon that can come from erratic heating. And then all these are distilled at 25 milliliters per 15 minutes using only a one variable system. So it's only the energy input into the boiler is all it takes. You have air-cooled condensing in between the two rectifiers, the inner and the outer, and then you eventually have a classic water condenser. So all you have to do is regulate the heat. For me, I use a 115 volt heating mantle, and typically I'm looking at 42% of energy here. So if you have a variac, if you have different kinds of voltage regulations, I'd be on a 42. And then I'm like 42, and then there's a little bit of a dismount here in the fourth fraction where it has to step up, and maybe you're going to start at 42, but you're going to end at 70. And you might have to go from 42 to 55, you know, to 70 as you sort of collect the fraction to successfully achieve the whole thing in 15 minutes. Then when you get into the fifth fraction, you can pretty much coast. Often 70 to 72% of energy will allow me to collect all the last four fractions in the 15-minute allotment. And it's mainly because here, you know, ethanol would skew the energy needs, and then you see the energy needs of water become very constant. And so that is just sort of how you schedule the heating profile. You know, in the old timers, they did this with a Bunsen burner, and it's a lot easier with a voltage regulator that has like a numerical output. So we're gonna let these sit for an hour. We'll come back and do a tasting, and then I'll sort of explain some of the descriptive systems I use, which differ a little bit.